The autumn wind rattled the stained glass windows of Bethel Pines Community Church as Pastor Jeremiah Caldwell adjusted his black tie one final time. October 15th, 1873, a date that would be seared into the collective memory of this small Michigan Territory settlement, nestled between dense pine forests and forgotten Indian trails. The church, built in 1852 with rough-hewn timber and a simple bell tower, had seen 2 generations of families worship within its walls. Tonight, it would witness something that would haunt the territory forever. Margaret Thompson sat in the 3rd pew from the front, her work-worn hands folded tightly in her wool skirt. At 38, she had raised 6 children largely on her own since her husband's death in a logging accident 3 years prior. Her youngest, 8-year-old Timothy, fidgeted beside her, his sandy hair still bearing traces of the pomade she'd applied before leaving their modest log cabin. The boy's eyes wandered to the other children scattered throughout the sanctuary, 46 other young souls, ranging from 6 to 16 years old. "The children's choir will now lead us in our closing hymn," Pastor Caldwell announced, his deep voice echoing off the wooden rafters. The man was in his early 40s with graying temples and intense blue eyes that seemed to penetrate straight through to one's conscience. He had arrived in Bethel Pines 2 years earlier from parts unknown, bringing with him a fervor that both inspired and unsettled the congregation. Timothy joined the other children as they filed toward the front of the church. Margaret noticed how the October chill seemed to seep through the log building's chinking, making her pull her heavy shawl tighter around her shoulders. The sanctuary was dimly lit by oil lamps and a few candles that cast long shadows across the congregation of 63 adults. Sarah Mitchell, the church organist, began playing a melody on the small pump organ that Margaret didn't recognize. The tune was haunting, almost hypnotic, with minor chords that seemed to linger in the air longer than they should. The children began to sing, their voices blending in perfect harmony, despite never having rehearsed this particular song together. "Come, little lambs, to the shepherd's call. Walk through the valley where shadows fall. Leave behind the world of light. Step into the eternal night." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. She glanced around at the other parents, the Hendersons, the Kowalskis, the Brennans, all wearing expressions of rapt attention. Some had their eyes closed, swaying slightly to the unfamiliar melody. Others stared straight ahead with an intensity that made Margaret uncomfortable. The hymn continued for what felt like an eternity, verses that spoke of journeys and transformation, of children called to serve a higher purpose. Margaret's maternal instincts screamed that something was wrong, but the melody seemed to wrap around her thoughts like a fog, making it difficult to focus on her growing unease. When the last note faded into silence, Pastor Caldwell raised his hands for the final blessing. "Go now in peace," he intoned. Knowing that the faithful shall always find their way home, the congregation began to file out through the heavy wooden doors, chatting quietly about the upcoming harvest and Mrs. Peterson's apple preserves. Margaret lingered near her pew, expecting Timothy to bound over with his usual post-service energy. But when she looked toward the front of the church, the space where the children had been standing was empty. She assumed they had already run outside to play in the churchyard, as they often did after evening services. Outside, the October air was crisp and clear, with a canopy of stars visible above the tree line. Parents gathered in small groups, discussing the week's events while keeping one eye on their children. But as the minutes passed, a strange quiet settled over the yard. "Has anyone seen the young ones?" called out Bob Henderson, a burly man who worked the family's timber claim. His twin daughters, Lucy and Linda, were nowhere to be seen. Margaret felt her chest tighten. "Timothy?" she called out, her voice carrying across the empty yard. "Timothy, come on, it's time to go home." One by one, the parents began calling for their children. Names echoed through the night air. Jennifer, Michael, Susan, David. But no young voices answered back. The area where children's coats were usually left during services was completely empty. Pastor Caldwell emerged from the church, locking the heavy doors behind him with an iron key. "Is there a problem?" he asked, noticing the cluster of worried parents. "Pastor, where are the children?" Margaret's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "They were just inside singing and now they're gone." The pastor's expression remained calm, almost serene. "Perhaps they decided to walk home together," he suggested. "You know how children can be after an inspiring service." The Spirit moves them in mysterious ways. But Margaret knew her son, Timothy, was shy and cautious, not the type to wander off without permission, especially not in the dark forest that surrounded their settlement. Several other parents voiced similar concerns about their own children's behavior. "We need to search for them," declared Frank Kowalski, whose 12-year-old daughter Anna had never missed her Sunday night return home. "Something's not right here." The parents organized into search groups, combing through the surrounding woods with kerosene lanterns borrowed from the church. They called out names until their voices grew hoarse, following every deer path and checking every clearing where children might play. The dense pine forest seemed to swallow their voices, returning only the sound of wind through branches and the distant howl of a wolf. Hours passed. The temperature dropped, and a light frost began to form on the grass. By midnight, someone had ridden to fetch Constable Roy Brennan from the county seat 10 miles away. He arrived with 2 volunteer deputies as dawn approached. He was a tall, weathered man in his late 40s who had served the territory for over a decade. His own grandson, 9-year-old Christopher, was among the missing children. "Now let's think about this sensibly," Constable Brennan said, addressing the gathered parents by lamplight. 47 children don't just vanish into thin air. They had to go somewhere. But as the night wore on and the search expanded to include neighboring homesteads and the old Indian trails that crisscrossed the forest, no trace of the children could be found. No footprints in the soft earth around the church, no discarded clothing or personal belongings, no witnesses who had seen a group of children walking along the territorial roads. As dawn broke over Bethel Pines, painting the sky in shades of gray and pale yellow, the terrible truth began to settle over the community. 47 children had simply disappeared without a trace. The last anyone had seen of them, they were standing in the front of the church singing a hymn that no one could quite remember, their young voices raised in perfect haunting harmony. Margaret Thompson stood at her cabin window, still wearing her Sunday dress, watching the sun rise over fields that suddenly felt empty and cold. Somewhere in the distance, she could swear she still heard the echo of that strange, hypnotic melody, and her son's voice singing words that made no sense in the harsh light of morning. The nightmare of Bethel Pines had only just begun. Constable Roy Brennan hadn't slept in 2 days. His eyes were bloodshot and his wool uniform wrinkled as he sat across from Pastor Jeremiah Caldwell in the small interrogation room at the Territorial Courthouse in Grand Rapids. The room was lit by oil lamps, casting flickering shadows on both men's faces. Outside, October rain drummed against the windows, matching the steady rhythm of Brennan's growing frustration. "Pastor, I need you to walk me through Sunday night one more time," Brennan said, his voice hoarse from coordinating search efforts across 3 counties. Every detail, no matter how small. Caldwell sat with perfect posture, his hands folded calmly on the wooden table. Despite the circumstances, he appeared remarkably composed. "Constable, as I've explained before, the service proceeded normally. We had our usual readings, a brief sermon about faith and sacrifice, and the children's choir performed beautifully. This hymn they sang, what was it called? I'm afraid I don't recall the specific title. Sarah Mitchell would know better. She selected the music." Caldwell's blue eyes met Brennan's steadily. "Perhaps you should speak with her again." Brennan had already interviewed Sarah Mitchell twice. The 50-year-old organist claimed she couldn't remember playing any unusual music that night. In fact, her recollection of the entire evening seemed strangely vague, as if she were recounting a half-remembered dream. "Pastor, 47 children are missing from your congregation. Their parents are desperate. I need more than vague answers." "Constable, I understand your frustration, but I've told you everything I can remember. The service ended, I gave the blessing, and everyone left. I assumed the children had gone outside to play or had already started walking home with friends." Brennan studied the pastor's face for any sign of deception. In his decade of territorial law enforcement, he'd developed a good sense for when people were lying. But Caldwell's expression remained maddeningly serene, almost otherworldly in its calm. A knock at the door interrupted the interview. Deputy Martinez entered carrying a leather satchel. "Constable, you need to see this." Brennan opened the satchel to find several daguerreotype photographs taken inside the church by a traveling photographer who had been documenting frontier settlements. "We had these developed in Detroit," Martinez explained. "Found something peculiar in the children's section. The photographs showed the front pews where the children typically sat during services. But instead of the worn wooden benches that had been there for decades, the images revealed freshly sanded and varnished wood, as if the pews had been recently refinished or replaced entirely. "Pastor," Brennan said slowly, "when were these pews last worked on?" Caldwell glanced at the photographs with mild interest. "I believe the church elders refinished them a few weeks ago. The wood was getting quite worn from 20 years of use." "Interesting thing," Deputy Martinez interjected. "I spoke with Tom Morrison, one of the founding church elders. He says they haven't done any work on the pews since the church was built in 1852. For the first time since the interview began, something flickered across Caldwell's face, just for a moment, like a shadow passing over still water. Perhaps Tom is mistaken. Men his age sometimes have trouble with their memory. Brennan felt his patience wearing thin. "Pastor, I'm going to ask you directly. Do you know what happened to those children?" "Constable, I wish I could provide you with the answers you seek, but I'm as mystified by their disappearance as anyone else. Have you considered that they might have simply decided to journey west together? Children can be impulsive, especially when they feel called to something greater than themselves." The phrase struck Brennan as odd. Called to what? To adventure, to new territories. Young people often feel the need to break free from the constraints of settlement life. Perhaps they've gone to seek their fortunes in the western lands. Outside the courthouse, the territorial authorities struggled to coordinate search efforts across vast wilderness areas. Volunteer posses on horseback combed through hundreds of square miles of forest. Telegraph messages were sent to settlements throughout Michigan Territory and beyond, asking for any sightings of a large group of children traveling together. After dismissing Pastor Caldwell with a warning not to leave the territory, Brennan walked over to his desk where stacks of missing person reports waited to be filed. 47 individual cases, each one representing a family torn apart by uncertainty and fear. Deputy Sarah Chen approached with a cup of coffee. "Constable, we just received a telegram from the Federal Marshal's office in Detroit. They're sending an investigator down tomorrow." Brennan nodded grimly. The involvement of federal authorities would bring resources and expertise, but it would also mean attention from territorial newspapers and possibly interference from politicians. "Any word from the search parties?" "Nothing concrete. They found some old camping gear about 5 miles north of the settlement, but it's been there for months. No fresh tracks, no signs of recent activity." Brennan rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of 47 families' hopes pressing down on him. In his career, he'd dealt with missing persons cases before, usually runaway teenagers or adults who decided to disappear to avoid debts or family obligations, but never children this young, and never in such numbers. A messenger boy arrived with a telegram that made Brennan's blood run cold. It was from Constable William Parker in Millbrook, Pennsylvania. "Stop. Read your inquiry about missing children. Stop. Similar incident here, 1867. Stop. 12 children vanished after church service. Stop. Pastor named Caldwell involved. Stop. We'll send details by post. Stop." Brennan immediately sent telegrams to law enforcement in neighboring states, asking for any information about Pastor Jeremiah Caldwell or similar disappearances involving children and church services. Within hours, more telegrams began arriving. Cedar Falls, Iowa reported 8 children missing in 1870 after a special church service led by a traveling pastor named Caldwell. Springfield, Illinois had lost 6 children in 1869 under remarkably similar circumstances. "Deputy Martinez," Brennan called out, "I want you to ride to Detroit and send telegrams to every major settlement from here to California. I need a complete history of this Pastor Caldwell and every place he's ever preached. You think he's done this before? I think Pastor Jeremiah Caldwell is not the simple man of God he pretends to be. And until we figure out what he really is, those children are still out there somewhere." Meanwhile, Margaret Thompson had made a disturbing discovery in her son's room. While searching through Timothy's belongings for any clue about where he might have gone, she found a piece of sheet music hidden beneath his mattress. The paper was yellowed with age, and the musical notation was written in faded black ink. The title at the top read, "The Shepherd's Call," in elaborate script. But what made Margaret's hands tremble was the signature at the bottom, E. Caldwell, 1836. She immediately took the sheet music to Constable Brennan, who studied it with growing alarm. If this was genuine, it suggested that Pastor Caldwell's connection to strange hymns and missing children went back decades, possibly involving other members of his family. The lyrics were as disturbing as they were mysterious. "Come, little lambs, to the shepherd's call. Walk through the valley where shadows fall. Leave behind the world of light. Step into the eternal night. Follow the path that few have trod. To serve the will of the chosen God. Your voice is raised in sacred song. Your journey will be pure and long." There were 6 more verses, each one more troubling than the last. References to the faithful flock and the shepherd's sacred duty, and children who transcend the earthly realm. The musical notation itself was unlike anything the local musicians had seen before. Complex harmonies that seemed to create mathematical patterns within the melody. Brennan called in Dr. Ellen Vasquez, one of the few educated women in the territory, who had studied music and mathematics at Oberlin College before coming west with her physician husband. She examined the sheet music with a scholar's eye. "Constable, this is extraordinary," she said after careful study. "The mathematical relationships between these notes follow patterns that I've only seen in the most advanced musical theory. This isn't the work of a simple frontier preacher. This was composed by someone with deep knowledge of harmonic principles." What does that tell us about the children? If children sang this exact composition, in these precise harmonies, Dr. Vasquez paused, choosing her words carefully. There are theories about sound frequencies and their effects on human consciousness. Music has been used for religious and psychological purposes throughout history. This particular arrangement might have been designed to induce a specific mental state. Brennan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. "You're saying he hypnotized them?" "I'm saying that certain combinations of musical tones can create profound effects on the human mind, especially in young people whose brains are still developing. If Pastor Caldwell used music to influence the children's behavior, he could have convinced them to follow him willingly." As night fell over Bethel Pines for the 3rd time since the disappearance, search parties continued their methodical sweep of the surrounding wilderness. Lantern light cut through the darkness. Voices called out names that received no answer, and parents maintained their desperate vigil. But deep in the pine forest, where the oldest trees grew thick and the canopy blocked out even starlight, something else moved through the shadows. Those with keen ears might have heard it. The faint sound of children's voices, singing in perfect harmony, their melody carried on the autumn wind like a half-remembered lullaby. Henry Walsh, the church sexton who had served Bethel Pines for over 30 years, made his own disturbing discovery. While searching the church basement for any clues the authorities might have missed, he found a hidden compartment behind the coal bin. Inside was a collection of handwritten documents, wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from moisture. The papers included detailed maps of the surrounding territory, lists of family names with children's ages noted beside them, and most disturbing of all, what appeared to be a schedule of services planned for other settlements throughout the Michigan Territory and beyond. At the bottom of one document, in the same handwriting that had signed the sheet music, was a chilling note. "The harvest of Bethel Pines is complete. 47 voices now join the eternal choir. Next gathering, St. Mary's Settlement, Wisconsin Territory, October 1874. Walsh immediately brought the documents to Constable Brennan, who realized with growing horror that the disappearance of the Bethel Pines children might not be an isolated incident but part of a larger, more sinister plan that had been years in the making. Somewhere in the vast wilderness of the American frontier, 47 children were learning songs that would soon echo across the continent, carrying a message that would chill the blood of anyone who truly understood its meaning. The investigation was just beginning, and already Constable Brennan suspected that the truth would be far more disturbing than anyone in the territory could imagine. Federal Marshal Rebecca Torres had traveled by train from Detroit to Grand Rapids, then by horseback through 40 miles of rough frontier territory to reach the small settlement of Bethel Pines. She was one of only a handful of women in federal law enforcement, having earned her position through exceptional skill in investigation and an uncanny ability to solve cases that baffled her male colleagues. She stood in the makeshift command center that had been established in the settlement's meeting hall, studying hand-drawn maps and witness statements spread across multiple tables. The autumn morning light filtered through simple glass windows, illuminating the faces of increasingly desperate parents who had gathered to hear any updates. "Marshal Torres," Constable Brennan approached, carrying a fresh stack of documents. "The inquiries about Pastor Caldwell came back by telegraph. You're going to want to see this." Torres, a sharp-featured woman in her early 30s with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, accepted the papers and began reading. Her expression grew more troubled with each page. "Jeremiah Caldwell has preached at 6 different settlements over the past 15 years, she said aloud, her voice carrying across the room. Each position lasted approximately 2 to 3 years, and at 3 of those previous locations there were unexplained disappearances involving children from his congregations. The room fell silent, except for the soft sobbing of Mrs. Henderson, whose twin daughters had been among the missing. "What kind of disappearances?" asked Frank Kowalski, his weathered hands clenched into fists. Torres consulted her notes. Millbrook, Pennsylvania, 1867. 12 children vanished after a church youth gathering. Authorities concluded they had run away to join a traveling circus. Cedar Falls, Iowa, 1870. 8 children disappeared following a special Sunday service. Case closed after 2 weeks, when investigators determined it was a group exodus to avoid troubled home situations. "That's impossible," Margaret Thompson's voice cut through the murmur of shocked conversation. "These weren't troubled children. Timothy was happy, well-adjusted. He would never run away into the wilderness." Marshal Torres nodded sympathetically. "Mrs. Thompson, I've reviewed the character assessments we've compiled on all 47 children. None of them fit the typical runaway pattern. They were from stable homes, performed well in their limited schooling, and had strong community ties." Constable Brennan cleared his throat. "There's more. We found this sheet music in Timothy Thompson's bedroom." He held up the yellowed paper with the shepherd's call written in faded ink. "The signature dates back to 1836, when Caldwell would have been just a child." Dr. Ellen Vasquez, who had been brought in to consult on the case, examined the sheet music carefully. "The lyrics are deeply troubling from a psychological standpoint. They contain classic elements of what scholars call mass persuasion, references to leaving the known world behind, following a charismatic leader, and surrendering individual will to a higher purpose." Marshal Torres had been thinking along similar lines. "Constable, I'd like to send telegrams to law enforcement in the pastor's previous settlements. If there's a pattern here, someone might have information that could help us." 2 days later, Torres received a detailed letter from retired Constable William Parker from Millbrook, Pennsylvania. The elderly man's handwriting carried the weight of an unsolved case that had haunted him for 6 years. "Those 12 children just vanished without a trace," Parker had written. "We searched for weeks, brought in tracking dogs from Philadelphia, organized volunteer groups from 5 counties. Never found so much as a footprint, but I'll tell you something that's bothered me ever since. The parents all seemed strangely calm about it." Torres studied the letter carefully. Parker continued, "You'd expect folks to be hysterical when their children disappear, right? But these parents, it was like they were in some kind of trance. They went through the motions of being worried, but there was something underneath, something peaceful, like they knew something the rest of us didn't." The marshal felt a chill run down her spine as she read Parker's final observation. "My wife attended that church sometimes, said they'd started singing hymns she'd never heard before. Real haunting melodies that seemed to stick in your head for days afterward. She stopped going because the music gave her nightmares." Torres immediately sent additional inquiries to investigators in Cedar Falls, Iowa, and other settlements where Caldwell had preached. The responses painted a remarkably similar picture across multiple states and territories. Detective Ray Hutchinson from Cedar Falls wrote, 8 children, all from good families, all active in the church youth program. The night they disappeared, there had been a special service, something about the calling of the faithful young. Parents said the children seemed unusually excited about attending, talked about it for days beforehand. But it was a letter from an elderly woman named Clara Mitchell in Springfield, Illinois, that provided the most disturbing information. Her 6-year-old grandson had been among the children who vanished there in 1869. "Pastor Caldwell wasn't his real name," she wrote in shaky handwriting. "I recognized him from when I was a girl in Ohio. Back then he was called Pastor Ezekiel Caldwell, and he looked exactly the same. Didn't appear to have aged a day in 30 years. There were stories about his family, whispers that they had been practicing some kind of old religion that came from Europe, something that wasn't quite Christian despite all the Bible quotes." Torres documented every detail, building a timeline that stretched back nearly 4 decades. The pattern was unmistakable. A man calling himself Caldwell would arrive in a small, isolated community, quickly establish himself as a charismatic spiritual leader, and within 2 to 3 years, children would disappear under mysterious circumstances. The cases would be explained away as group runaways or family relocations, and Caldwell would quietly move on to his next congregation. Back in Bethel Pines, the search efforts continued with military precision. Hundreds of volunteers on horseback combed through forests, abandoned cabins, and remote homesteads. Professional trackers had been brought in from as far away as Chicago, and even some friendly Ojibwe guides had joined the search, though they reported finding no trace of the children's passage through the wilderness. But it was Henry Walsh, the church sexton, who provided the most disturbing clue yet. The 60-year-old man had worked at the Bethel Pines Community Church since its construction in 1852. He shuffled into the constable's office on Wednesday morning, carrying a small wooden box under his arm. "Constable, I found this hidden in the church bell tower yesterday," Walsh said, his voice shaky with age and emotion. "Been thinking about those missing children, so I went back to check places most folks don't look." Inside the box were dozens of handwritten sheets of music, all bearing titles like The Shepherd's Call, Children of the Chosen, and The Sacred Journey. Each one was signed with different variations of the name Caldwell, with dates spanning from 1834 to 1873. "Henry," Constable Brennan said carefully, "these dates go back almost 40 years. Pastor Caldwell only arrived here 2 years ago." The old sexton nodded slowly. "That's what's been bothering me, Constable. I've been maintaining that bell tower since the church was built. These papers, they weren't there when I cleaned it out last spring." Marshal Torres examined the sheet music under a magnifying glass borrowed from the settlement's doctor. "The ink appears to be the same age as the paper. This wasn't written recently on old paper. But how could multiple people named Caldwell have composed music for this specific church decades before any of them arrived?" "Doctor." Vasquez studied the lyrics carefully. "These songs tell a story," she observed. "They're designed to be sung in sequence like a musical narrative. The early songs focus on calling the faithful, the middle ones describe a journey or transformation, and the final compositions." She paused, her face pale. "What is it?" Torres asked. "The final songs describe children who have transcended earthly bonds and joined the eternal choir." Marshal Torres, "I don't think these children ran away. I think someone convinced them they were being called to something spiritual, something that required them to leave everything behind." That evening, as the 4th day of searching drew to a close without any trace of the missing children, Margaret Thompson sat in her small log cabin staring at Timothy's unused supper bowl. The silence was overwhelming, no sound of small feet running across the wooden floor, no chatter about the day's adventures, no requests for just one more story before bed. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Pastor Caldwell standing on her porch holding a small bouquet of late-season wildflowers. "Margaret, I wanted to stop by and offer my condolences during this difficult time," he said, his voice filled with practiced sympathy. Something about his presence made her deeply uncomfortable, though she couldn't quite identify why. "Pastor, my son isn't dead. He's missing. There's a difference." Caldwell's expression remained serene. "Of course, my apologies. I simply meant to offer comfort during your time of uncertainty. Timothy was such a special child, so receptive to spiritual guidance." "What do you mean by that?" "Oh, just that he seemed particularly attuned to the deeper mysteries of faith. Some children are born with old souls, ready to answer a higher calling when it comes." Margaret felt her chest tighten with a fear she couldn't name. "Pastor, do you know something about where my son is?" "I know that the Lord works in mysterious ways, Margaret. Sometimes what appears to be loss is actually transformation. Sometimes children must leave their earthly families to join a more eternal one." Before Margaret could respond, Caldwell turned and walked away, disappearing into the gathering darkness of the frontier evening. She stood in her doorway for a long time afterward, watching the empty trail and trying to shake the feeling that she had just heard a confession wrapped in the language of faith. In the distance, carried on the October wind through the vast wilderness, she could swear she heard the sound of children singing, a melody both beautiful and terrifying, voices raised in perfect harmony somewhere beyond the edge of the known world. The investigation was expanding beyond the borders of Michigan territory. and Marshal Torres suspected that Pastor Caldwell was just one part of a network that had been operating across the American frontier for decades. Somewhere in the endless forests and unmapped territories of the West, 47 children were learning songs that would soon echo across the continent, carrying a message that would challenge everything people believed about the boundaries between faith and madness. The breakthrough came when Marshal Torres received a package by special courier from the Federal Records Office in Washington. She had been sleeping fitfully in the settlement's small inn, her dreams haunted by images of missing children and haunting melodies she'd never actually heard. "Marshal Torres," Constable Brennan said, entering the inn's common room where she was examining the documents by lamplight. "We've been researching the Caldwell family history as far back as the records go. What we found is disturbing." Torres spread out the papers on the rough wooden table. The man calling himself Jeremiah Caldwell was born Jeremy Caldwell Morrison in 1832 in a remote religious community in the mountains of Pennsylvania. His father, Ezekiel Caldwell Morrison, ran a small sect called the Eternal Flock. Brennan leaned forward. "What happened to this community? That's where it gets strange. In 1850, the entire community vanished overnight. 38 adults and 22 children, gone without a trace. Local authorities found the settlement completely abandoned. Food still on tables, clothes still hanging on lines, but not a single person anywhere." Torres felt her blood run cold. "Any theories about what happened?" The official report suggested they might have moved collectively to the Western Territories, possibly to avoid some debts or religious persecution, but there's an unofficial witness statement from a neighboring farmer who claimed he heard singing coming from the settlement in the middle of the night. Children's voices, he said, singing hymns in a language he'd never heard before. Brennan studied a daguerreotype included in the documents. "Marshal, look at this photograph of Ezekiel Caldwell Morrison, taken in 1848. He placed it next to a more recent sketch of Pastor Jeremiah Caldwell. The resemblance is remarkable." Torres examined both images carefully. "More than remarkable. If I didn't know better, I'd say they were the same person. But that's impossible. This photograph is 25 years old." "There's more," Brennan continued. "We found records of similar communities and disappearances stretching back to the 1790s, all led by men named Caldwell or Morrison, all involving unexplained mass vanishings, and all associated with reports of unusual music." Torres spread out a hand-drawn map where she'd marked all the known disappearances with red ink. "Look at the pattern. They're not random. There's a geographic progression, always moving west, always staying in isolated areas with dense forest cover and limited law enforcement. If you connect these points, it leads to the vast wilderness territories of the far west, thousands of square miles of unmapped forest, abandoned mining camps, and territory so remote that entire communities could exist without any contact with civilization." Brennan reached for his notebook. "We need to expand our investigation immediately, if this is part of something larger." But Torres shook her head. "Constable, if I'm right about this, a traditional manhunt won't work. These people, Caldwell and whoever he's working with, they've been planning this for generations. They'll have escape routes, supply caches, ways to disappear into territory no federal marshal has ever mapped. Then what do you suggest?" Torres looked out the window at the dark forest surrounding Bethel Pines. "We need to understand how they communicate with each other. The music, the hymns, they're not just songs, they're signals, instructions, maybe even locations encoded in musical form." Dr. Vasquez, who had been working late analyzing the recovered sheet music by candlelight, looked up from her workstation. "Marshal Torres, I believe you're correct. I've been studying the mathematical patterns in these compositions, and there are numerical relationships between the notes that don't make sense from a purely artistic standpoint." She spread several sheets of music across a table. "Look at this. If you assign numerical values to the notes based on their position in the musical scale, and then group them according to the rhythm patterns, you get sequences that could represent coordinates, dates, or coded messages." Torres felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to align. "Dr. Vasquez, how long would it take you to decode these fully?" "With the right calculations and some assistance from a mathematics professor, perhaps several days to a week. Do it." "And Constable, I need you to organize the largest search party this territory has ever seen. If we can decode these locations, we're going to need to move quickly and with overwhelming force." As dawn broke over Bethel Pines on the 5th day since the children's disappearance, the investigation had transformed from a missing persons case into a multi-territorial operation targeting what appeared to be a sophisticated religious organization that had been operating across the American frontier for decades. But in her heart, Margaret Thompson cared nothing about the larger investigation. She sat in the meeting hall clutching a cup of cold coffee and staring at a hand-drawn map covered in search areas and red marks. Somewhere out there, her 8-year-old son was counting on adults to find him and bring him home safely. "Mrs. Thompson?" Marshal Torres approached gently. "I wanted to update you on our progress." Margaret looked up with eyes red from days of crying and sleepless nights. "Have you found them?" "We're getting closer. We believe Pastor Caldwell has been taking children to remote locations where they're held by a larger organization. We're working to identify these locations now." Are they alive?" Torres chose her words carefully. "Mrs. Thompson, we have every reason to believe the children are alive and unharmed. Based on our research, this organization seems to view children as valuable recruits rather than victims of violence." It wasn't the complete truth, but it wasn't a lie either. Torres had seen enough cases involving religious extremists to know that while physical violence wasn't always involved, the psychological manipulation could be just as devastating. Children who had been indoctrinated into extremist groups often emerged fundamentally changed. Their personalities and beliefs altered in ways that took years to address. A commotion near the main entrance drew their attention. Pastor Caldwell was walking into the meeting hall, flanked by 2 men in dark coats who appeared to be lawyers from the territorial capital. "Constable Brennan," one of the men announced, "my client would like to make a statement regarding the missing children." The room fell silent. Parents gathered closer, their faces a mixture of hope and suspicion. Torres noticed that Caldwell's serene expression had changed subtly. There was something almost triumphant in his eyes now. "I want to help bring these children home," Caldwell said, his voice carrying clearly across the room. "But first, I think it's important that everyone understand the truth about what happened Sunday night." Constable Brennan stepped forward. "Pastor, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be documented and used in territorial court." Caldwell waved dismissively. "I'm not confessing to a crime, Constable. I'm offering to explain a miracle." He turned to address the gathered parents directly. "Your children weren't taken. They were chosen. They heard a calling that transcends the limited understanding of this earthly existence, and they answered that call with the pure faith that only children possess." Margaret Thompson shot to her feet. "Where is my son?" Caldwell's gaze settled on her with something that might have been pity. "Timothy is exactly where he needs to be, Margaret. He's with others who understand his special gifts, learning truths that will prepare him for a purpose greater than anything this small settlement could offer." "You sick monster!" Frank Kowalski snarled, lunging toward the pastor before being restrained by 2 deputies. But Caldwell continued speaking as if he hadn't been interrupted. "The children are safe, happy, and well cared for. They're learning songs that will open doorways to eternal wisdom. Soon, when their training is complete, they'll help us call others to join them in paradise." Marshal Torres stepped forward. "Pastor Caldwell, are you saying you know where these children are?" "I'm saying that they're where they belong, Marshal Torres. And soon, very soon, their voices will be heard again. Not just in Bethel Pines, but in settlements across this great nation. The shepherd's flock is growing, and the children will lead the way." Before anyone could respond, both lawyers flanked Caldwell and began walking him toward the exit. "My client has said all he intends to say at this time," one of them announced. As they reached the door, Caldwell turned back one final time. "The faithful will always find their way home," he said, echoing the final words of his Sunday night blessing. "And home is not always where we expect it to be." After he left, the meeting hall erupted in angry voices and demands for action. But Torres stood quietly, her mind racing through the implications of what she'd just heard. Caldwell's statement hadn't been a confession. It had been a warning. He was telling them that whatever was happening to the children of Bethel Pines was just the beginning of something much larger. Dr. Ellen Vasquez hadn't slept in 20 hours. But the breakthrough she'd just made sent energy coursing through her exhausted system, surrounded by handwritten calculations, musical notation charts, and empty coffee cups. She stared at the decoded message that had emerged from Pastor Caldwell's seemingly innocent hymns. "Marshal Torres, you need to see this immediately." she called across the meeting hall that had been converted into their command center. Torres hurried over, noting the excitement and concern warring on the scholar's face. "What did you find?" "The sheet music isn't just encoded with locations, it's a complete operational manual. Look at this." Vasquez pointed to her calculations where she'd converted the musical notes into numerical sequences. The first hymn, The Shepherd's Call, contains coordinates for 6 different sites across Michigan Territory and Wisconsin Territory. But the second piece, Children of the Chosen, provides timing sequences. Timing for what? For coordinated recruitment events. If I'm reading this correctly, Bethel Pines wasn't an isolated incident. There are supposed to be simultaneous disappearances at multiple settlements this weekend. Torres felt her stomach drop. This weekend? That's in 2 days. Saturday night, to be exact, and based on the mathematical progressions in the music, each location is supposed to contribute a specific number of children. Vasquez pulled up a detailed chart. Bethel Pines was 47. But there are notations for groups of 31, 42, and 58 at other locations. Constable Brennan joined them, his face grim. "Marshal Torres, we just received telegrams from 3 other settlements in Michigan and Wisconsin territories. They've all reported unusual activity at their local churches over the past month. New pastors arriving unexpectedly, sudden changes in musical programming, and children becoming unusually enthusiastic about attending services." Torres immediately began drafting urgent telegrams. "We need federal marshals mobilized to all those locations immediately. If this is a coordinated operation, we're looking at potentially 178 missing children by Sunday morning." While Torres coordinated with federal authorities across multiple territories, Constable Brennan received an unexpected visitor. Henry Walsh, the church sexton, shuffled into the meeting hall carrying a larger wooden crate. "Constable, I went back to the church one more time," Walsh said, his aged hands trembling slightly. "Found this hidden in the cellar behind the old coal stores, wrapped in oilcloth like someone was trying to preserve it. Inside the crate was an ornate wooden music box, intricately carved with religious symbols and what appeared to be a shepherd surrounded by children. When opened, it played a haunting melody that made everyone in the room fall silent. Doctor." Vasquez immediately recognized the tune. "That's the opening bars of The Shepherd's Call. But this music box looks like it's from the early 1800s at least." Walsh nodded slowly. "That's what's been troubling me, Doctor. My father helped build this church back in 1852, and he used to tell stories about finding strange things buried around the building site, like someone had been using this land for religious purposes long before our settlement was established." Torres examined the music box more closely. "There's an inscription inside the lid," she announced. "The song Eternal calls to those who would answer. The shepherd's voice echoes through generations. What was begun shall be completed." "Marshal Torres," Constable Brennan said quietly, "what if this isn't a recent organization? What if it's something that's been operating for generations, maybe even since the earliest European settlements?" Torres felt the pieces of a much larger puzzle beginning to emerge. A generational network, passing down methods and objectives from one leader to the next. That would explain the sophisticated planning, the coded musical messages, the ability to make entire groups disappear without leaving traces. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a messenger on horseback, carrying dispatches from federal headquarters in Detroit. "Marshal Torres, we've been researching the Caldwell family history as far back as colonial records go. You're not going to believe what we found." Torres read the documents with growing alarm. Ezekiel Caldwell led a religious community in the Pennsylvania mountains that vanished in 1850. His father, Nathan Caldwell, founded a settlement in Virginia that was found abandoned in 1823. Nathan's father, Joshua Caldwell, established a commune in Massachusetts that disappeared in 1797. "How far back does this go?" Brennan asked. According to these records, the first documented Caldwell was a man named Abel Caldwell, who arrived from England in 1692, settling in the Salem area of Massachusetts, just as the witch trials were ending. He established a religious community that practiced what colonial authorities described as unnatural harmonies and songs that disturbed the peace of Christian souls. Torres spread out genealogical charts and historical documents. Each generation has refined the methods, expanded the organization, and collected progressively larger numbers of followers. Abel started with 12 families. Nathan's group numbered 43 people. Joshua's community had over 70 members when they disappeared. Dr. Vasquez studied the historical patterns. The timing between operations has been getting shorter and the numbers larger. We're looking at an organization that's been building towards some kind of culmination for almost 2 centuries. What kind of culmination? Brennan asked. Based on the decoded musical instructions and the historical pattern, I believe they're working toward a final gathering, a mass recruitment event that would bring together hundreds or possibly thousands of people, particularly children and young adults. Torres nodded grimly. And if our intelligence is correct about coordinated operations this weekend, we may be witnessing the beginning of that final phase. As the team began coordinating what would become the largest law enforcement operation in territorial history, Margaret Thompson sat alone in the church pew where her son Timothy usually sat during Sunday services. The building was empty and quiet, with only the soft sound of autumn wind through the wooden walls. She had come here hoping to feel closer to Timothy somehow, to understand what had drawn him away from everything he knew and loved. But sitting in the familiar space only deepened her sense of loss and confusion. A slight sound made her look up. Pastor Caldwell was standing in the sanctuary's side entrance, having apparently entered through a door that wasn't being watched. "Margaret," he said softly, "I thought I might find you here." "You're not supposed to be here," she replied, her voice tight with anger and fear. "This is still my church, Margaret, and you're still part of my flock." He moved closer, his footsteps echoing in the empty sanctuary. "I wanted to offer you one final opportunity." "Opportunity for what?" "To join your son. Timothy is learning such beautiful songs, Margaret. Songs that will open doorways to truths you can't imagine. He asks about you every day." Margaret felt her heart stop. "You've seen him? You know where he is?" "I know where all the children are. They're safe, happy, and discovering abilities they never knew they possessed. Timothy's voice has developed remarkably. He can now sing harmonies that would make angels weep. I want to see him." Caldwell smiled with what might have been genuine warmth. "That can be arranged, Margaret. But it would require faith on your part, faith to leave behind the limitations of this earthly existence and embrace something infinitely more beautiful." "What are you talking about?" "Tomorrow night, Margaret. Come to the old logging camp on Millpond Creek at midnight. Come alone, and come with an open heart. You'll see Timothy again, and you'll understand why he chose to answer the shepherd's call." Before Margaret could respond, Caldwell turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the empty church with a choice that would determine whether she ever saw her son again. Outside, autumn wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance, carried on the evening air, she could swear she heard the faint sound of children singing. Voices raised in harmony so perfect it seemed to transcend the boundaries between earth and heaven. The investigation was expanding beyond anything the territorial authorities had ever undertaken, and Marshal Torres suspected that the events in Bethel Pines were just the beginning of something that would challenge everything people believed about the nature of faith, family, and the mysterious forces that shaped human destiny on the American frontier. The Tactical Operations Center, established in the abandoned grain warehouse, buzzed with controlled intensity as teams prepared for simultaneous raids across 2 territories. Marshal Torres stood before a wall-mounted map, dotted with red pins, each representing a decoded location from Pastor Caldwell's musical messages. 6 sites in total, 3 in Michigan Territory's northern wilderness, and 3 in Wisconsin Territory, all within a 100-mile radius of dense, largely unexplored forest. "Team leaders, final briefing," Torres announced to the assembled group of federal marshals, territorial militia, and local law enforcement. "Based on our intelligence, we believe the children are being held at one or more of these locations. Our primary objective is rescue and recovery. Secondary objective is apprehension of the organization's leadership." Constable Brennan stepped forward with the latest reconnaissance reports. "Mounted scouts have identified structures at 4 of the 6 sites. 2 appear to be abandoned logging camps that have been renovated. 1 is a former mining operation with several intact buildings. The 4th is what looks like a purpose-built compound hidden in a valley about 30 miles northeast of here." "What about the other 2 locations?" asked Captain Rodriguez from the territorial militia. Dr. Vasquez consulted her decoded musical notes. "The remaining coordinates point to areas with no visible structures. They might be gathering points, supply caches, or," she hesitated, Based on the lyrical content of the hymns, they might be what the organization considers sacred sites. Torres divided the teams into 6 units, each led by experienced federal marshals or military officers. Remember, we're dealing with potentially hundreds of civilians who may have been psychologically manipulated. Children, teenagers, and adults who genuinely believe they're part of a religious calling. Use minimum force and maximum communication. As the teams prepared to deploy at first light, Torres received an urgent message delivered by a hard-riding courier from the Territorial Telegraph Office. Marshal Torres, we've intercepted strange radio transmissions from the target area. Torres looked confused. Radio transmissions? We don't have radio technology in 1873. I apologize, Marshal. I meant to say they've been using an old system of smoke signals and reflected sunlight to send coded messages. The Ojibwe scouts helping with our reconnaissance have observed these signals being exchanged between the various sites. Can they decode the messages? Preliminary analysis suggests they're mobilization signals. Whatever operation they have planned for this weekend, it may have been moved up to tonight. Torres felt her pulse quicken. How much time do we have? Unknown. But Marshal Torres, the signals are all pointing toward the compound in the valley, Site Alpha. If this is their primary location, that's where you'll find the leadership, and probably most of the children, Torres concluded grimly. 20 miles away, Margaret Thompson sat in her log cabin kitchen, staring at a note she had written and rewritten a dozen times. The mantel clock showed 10:30 p.m., and Pastor Caldwell's invitation to meet him at the old logging camp felt like both a lifeline and a trap. Constable Brennan, the note read, I've gone to find Timothy. Pastor Caldwell said he would take me to him. If something happens to me, know that I chose this. I couldn't live without trying to bring my son home. The meeting is at the Mill Pond Creek logging camp at midnight, Margaret. She left the note on her kitchen table, grabbed her heavy wool coat and lantern, and rode her husband's old horse into the night. The autumn air was cold and crisp, with a thin layer of frost beginning to form on the grass. As she followed the familiar forest trails toward Mill Pond Creek, Margaret tried to prepare herself for whatever she might find. The old logging camp had been abandoned for over 10 years, its buildings slowly being reclaimed by the forest. But as Margaret approached on horseback, she could see the warm glow of fires and lanterns illuminating several of the structures. More surprisingly, there were at least a dozen other horses tied among the trees. She wasn't the only parent who had received an invitation. Margaret dismounted and walked toward the largest building, her boots crunching on fallen leaves. As she got closer, she could hear something that made her heart race, the sound of children singing. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, dozens of young voices blending in perfect harmony. Inside the building, she found a scene that defied her expectations. The old logging facility had been transformed into something resembling a church sanctuary, with rough wooden benches arranged in rows facing a makeshift altar. But what drew her attention immediately were the children. 47 children, including her Timothy, stood in organized rows at the front of the room. They wore simple white robes and had expressions of serene concentration as they sang hymns Margaret had never heard before. Their voices created harmonies so complex and beautiful that they seemed to resonate in her very bones. Timothy looked healthy and well-fed, though there was something different about his eyes, a depth and intensity that seemed unusual for an 8-year-old child. When he saw her enter, he smiled but didn't break from the singing or leave his position with the other children. Around the room, Margaret recognized many of the other missing children's parents. The Hendersons sat in the front row, tears streaming down their faces as they watched their twin daughters sing. Frank Kowalski was there, along with the Brennans, and dozens of other families from Bethel Pines and neighboring settlements. Pastor Caldwell stood behind the children, conducting their singing with graceful hand movements. When he noticed Margaret's arrival, he smiled warmly and gestured for her to take a seat. "Welcome, Margaret," he said when the hymn concluded. "Timothy has been waiting for you." "I want to take him home," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course you do. But first, I'd like you to understand what home truly means." Caldwell addressed the entire gathering. "You've come here tonight because you love your children, because you want what's best for them. What you're about to witness will help you understand why they chose to answer a higher calling." The children began singing again, this time a song that seemed to tell a story. As their voices rose and fell in intricate patterns, Margaret felt something strange happening to her perception. The walls of the old building seemed to fade away, replaced by visions of vast landscapes and impossible architectures. She saw cities of light stretching beyond horizons, heard music that seemed to come from the fabric of creation itself. Around her, the other parents were experiencing similar visions. Some wept openly, others sat in stunned silence, all apparently seeing things that transcended their normal understanding of the world. "The children aren't just singing," Caldwell explained, his voice seeming to come from very far away. "They're opening doorways, creating pathways between this reality and realms of infinite possibility. This is what generations of my family have been working toward, the cultivation of voices pure enough to bridge the gap between the mundane and the eternal." Margaret struggled to maintain her focus, to resist the hypnotic pull of the children's singing. "Timothy," she called out. "Timothy, come to me." Her son looked at her with eyes that seemed far older than his 8 years. "Mama," he said softly, his voice carrying clearly despite the continued singing around him. "I can see things now, beautiful things. Places where music never ends and where children like us help others find their way home. Your home is with me, Timothy, in our cabin, in our life together. That was just the beginning, Mama. This is where I belong now, where we all belong." At that moment, the building's doors burst open and armed men in federal badges flooded into the room. "Federal marshals, everyone remain calm and stay seated." The children's singing stopped abruptly, but instead of fear or confusion, they looked at the federal officers with expressions of serene understanding. Timothy smiled at his mother one more time. "It's time for us to go home now, Mama. Our real home." Before Margaret could reach him, before the marshals could secure the area, the children began singing once more, but this time, their voices created harmonies unlike anything that had come before. The air itself seemed to shimmer and bend, reality warping around the sound of their perfect otherworldly chorus. And then, in a moment that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives, the children simply faded away, not disappearing in darkness, but dissolving into light, their voices becoming part of a music that seemed to echo from dimensions beyond human understanding. When the light faded and the singing stopped, 47 empty white robes lay on the floor where the children had been standing. Pastor Caldwell was gone as well, leaving behind only the devastated parents and a room full of federal marshals who would struggle for years to write reports that anyone would believe. Margaret Thompson fell to her knees beside Timothy's empty robe, holding the simple white fabric and crying for a son who had found his way to a home she could never reach. The other raids that night found similar scenes at 3 more locations. Empty robes, grieving parents, and no trace of the hundreds of children who had been called to answer the shepherd's song. 6 months after the events at the Mill Pond Creek logging camp, Marshal Rebecca Torres sat in a congressional hearing room in Washington, D.C., facing a panel of senators who struggled to comprehend her testimony. The official report on the Bethel Pines incident ran to over 500 pages, but the core facts remained as inexplicable as they had been that October night. Marshal Torres, Senator Patricia Hayes from the Territorial Affairs Committee, said carefully, "You're asking us to believe that 47 children simply vanished into thin air during a federal operation? Senator, what I'm telling you is what dozens of trained law enforcement officers witnessed. The children were there, singing in organized formation, and then they were not there. Physical evidence confirms their presence. We have their clothing, personal effects, even fresh footprints in the mud around the buildings. But they themselves disappeared in a manner that defies conventional explanation." Senator Robert Chen leaned forward. "Marshal Torres, in your professional opinion, do you believe these children are still alive?" Torres had wrestled with that question every day for 6 months. "Senator, I believe they exist. Whether that constitutes being alive in the traditional sense, I cannot say." The hearing was classified, the details sealed from public view. The official story released to territorial newspapers described a successful rescue operation that recovered most of the missing children, with a few still being sought in connection with an interstate kidnapping ring. The parents had been sworn to secrecy under federal authority, their grief hidden behind carefully crafted cover stories. Margaret Thompson never spoke publicly about what she witnessed that night. She returned to her log cabin and maintained Timothy's room exactly as he had left it, But neighbors noticed that she often sat on her front porch in the evenings, listening to something only she could hear. When pressed, she would only say that Timothy was singing with others now and that someday when her own calling came she would join him. Dr. Ellen Vasquez had been reassigned to a teaching position at a university in the East, but she continued her research into the musical codes found in Pastor Caldwell's compositions. Working with mathematicians and music theorists, she discovered that the mathematical relationships in the hymns corresponded to harmonic frequencies that shouldn't have been understood with 1873 technology. The music wasn't just encoded with locations and instructions, she explained to Torres during one of their informal meetings. It contained information about sound frequencies that could theoretically create resonance patterns affecting human consciousness. What we witnessed might have been a form of mass hypnosis achieved through perfectly coordinated musical vibrations. Constable Roy Brennan took early retirement after the incident, unable to reconcile what he had seen with 2 decades of law enforcement experience. He moved to a small farm outside Detroit and spent his days working the land. But fellow settlers noted that he never listened to music anymore and would leave any gathering where children were singing. The investigation into the Caldwell family history continued, revealing an organizational structure that spanned not just 4 generations, but potentially much longer. Researchers found references to similar disappearances dating back to the colonial period, always involving isolated religious communities and always associated with reports of unusual singing. Henry Walsh, the church sexton, became an unofficial historian of the events. He spent his remaining years documenting every detail he could remember about the church's history, creating a comprehensive record that future investigators might use to understand what had happened. In his notes, he wrote, "The music box still plays every night at exactly midnight. I've tried to stop it, tried to break it, but it keeps playing that same melody. Sometimes I think I can hear children's voices singing along with it, voices that seem to come from very far away. The song is beautiful and terrible, and I know that someday it will call to others. The shepherd's work is not finished." 2 years after the Bethel Pines incident, similar disappearances began occurring in frontier settlements across the Western Territories, small groups of children vanishing after church services, always preceded by reports of unusual hymns, and always leaving behind empty clothing arranged in perfect order. Marshal Torres, now leading a specialized federal task force dedicated to investigating such cases, tracked the pattern with growing dread. The geographic progression suggested movement toward specific destinations, remote areas of the far western territories where vast wilderness could hide almost anything. In her private moments, Torres often found herself humming melodies she couldn't identify, harmonies that seemed to exist at the edge of her memory. She had been exposed to the children singing for only a few minutes that night at the logging camp, but the music had embedded itself in her consciousness like a seed of pure sound. Dr. Vasquez warned her about this phenomenon during one of their consultations. Exposure to those specific harmonic frequencies appears to create a form of auditory imprinting. People who heard the children sing report ongoing experiences of phantom music, usually growing stronger over time. Are you saying I'm being called too? I'm saying that the music is designed to spread, to reach new listeners who might be receptive to its message. Rebecca, you need to be very careful. The children didn't just disappear. They were transformed into something that exists partially in our reality and partially in another. And that something is still actively recruiting. Torres took Dr. Vasquez's warning seriously, but she couldn't abandon her investigation. Too many children had vanished. Too many families had been destroyed by a mystery that conventional law enforcement couldn't address. 3 years after Bethel Pines, she received a letter with no return address, postmarked from a remote territorial outpost, somewhere in Montana Territory. Inside was a single sheet of handwritten music titled, "The Marshal's Calling," and signed T. Thompson in a child's careful handwriting. The letter itself contained only one sentence. "Marshal Torres, we are ready for you to come home now." That night, Torres dreamed of walking through forests of impossible beauty, guided by the voices of children who sang harmonies that rewrote the laws of nature with every note. She woke to find herself humming a melody she had never heard before, one that seemed to contain mathematical instructions for a journey beyond the boundaries of the known world. The next morning, she submitted her resignation to the Federal Marshal Service and began riding west, following a song only she could hear toward a destination that existed at the intersection of faith, sound, and the infinite mystery of what lay beyond human understanding. Her horse was found a week later near a remote mountain pass in Colorado Territory, still saddled but riderless. Her personal effects remained in the saddlebags, but Torres herself had vanished without a trace. Margaret Thompson received the news of Marshal Torres's disappearance with a strange sense of peace. She had been hearing Timothy's voice more clearly lately, not just in her dreams, but during her waking hours as well. He was calling to her, explaining that the transformation was beautiful, and that family was meant to be together. On a quiet Sunday evening in late autumn, exactly 4 years after Timothy's disappearance, Margaret Thompson walked into the empty Bethel Pines Community Church. The building had been abandoned since the events of 1873, but someone had left the old music box open on the altar, its haunting melody filling the sanctuary with perfect, eternal sound. As the music played, Margaret began to sing along, her voice joining harmonies that seemed to reach across dimensions. With each note, the boundaries between realities grew thinner, until finally she heard the voices she had been waiting for, 47 children singing in perfect chorus, welcoming her home to a place where music never ended and families were never separated. The next morning, searchers found her empty clothing arranged neatly in the front pew, but Margaret Thompson was nowhere to be found. Henry Walsh, now in his 70s and the last living witness to the original events, continued to document the ongoing mystery. In his final journal entry, written shortly before his own death from natural causes, he noted, "The music spreads like seeds on the wind, finding fertile ground in hearts that have been broken by loss or touched by wonder. It calls to those who are ready to believe in something beyond the ordinary boundaries of our earthly existence." The children were just the beginning, the first voices in a choir that will eventually span dimensions and transcend death itself. The shepherd's song continues, and somewhere in the spaces between notes, between heartbeats, between one reality and the next, the faithful gather to sing harmonies that will one day call us all home, to a music that never dies. Today, in frontier settlements across the American West, people sometimes report hearing children singing late at night, perfect harmonies that seem to come from everywhere and nowhere, melodies that linger in memory long after the sound has faded. Those who listen carefully might recognize voices they once knew, calling to them from a home that exists beyond the reach of maps or understanding. The music continues, patient and eternal, waiting for those who are ready to answer the shepherd's call and join the choir that sings at the edge of forever. And in the silence between notes, carried on the wind across vast territories where civilization has not yet reached, the children wait for their families to find the courage to follow them into the infinite song that has no beginning and no end.